You're on CYInterview.
I'm Chris Yandeck. Today on CYInterview, it's time for our yearly college football preview with the editor of the long-running College Football Preview magazine. Head over to philsteele.com and buy the physical or digital version of his yearly college football preview. It is a must for any college football fan. Phil, thanks for joining us on CYInterview. How are you?
Hey, I am doing great, Chris. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. So just to begin, how does it feel to be doing this for a 27th consecutive year?
You know, after last year, Chris, I can tell you I'm jumping through the roof with enthusiasm because last year at this time we were wondering if we're playing football. It turns out we didn't have fans in the stands. Conferences canceled, then came back. I think it makes everybody appreciate football all the more, and I think we'll have massive home field edges. But 27th year of the magazine, yeah, when it started out, I didn't know if it would ever get to 27 years, but we've gotten a little bit bigger, a little bit better each year. And this year I talked to 110 of the 130 head coaches, going over each team with them. So it's we get a little bit more coaches every single year.
Well, that's fantabulous. So before we get into conference play, what do you think are the best non-conference football games of this year in your eyes?
Oh, there's definitely some great ones out there. Start with Clemson, Georgia. You're talking about a possible playoff game right there in the first game of the season. And it's at a neutral site. Clemson's just a slight favorite in the game. I've got Clemson in the top 4 and Georgia number 5. So I think that's going to be a remarkable non-conference game right out of the box. How about Ohio State hosting Oregon early in the season? I think that's a big-time game for both. I mean, the Pac-12 has got to start winning some of these games. Ohio State does get that one at home. So I think those two really jump out at me. And then I also like, a game like Texas and Arkansas. While it's not a couple of top 10 teams battling each other, how about the renewal of that rivalry? It was always one of the best rivalry games each and every year, and now it finally returns.
So now you believe that Oklahoma is going to win the national title. That's your big prediction in this year's College Football Preview magazine. Tell me why.
Well, numerous factors. Now, if you go back to the playoff last year, Chris, the 4 playoff teams, I'll say this. Talking to the 110 coaches, almost every coach has an experienced team this year, 15, 16, 17 returning starters. And they all go 3 deep in the spring because of the fact that nobody lost eligibility from last year. But if you look at the 4 playoff teams from last year, they're all rather inexperienced. They have 9, 10, 11 returning starters, and all of them lose their starting quarterback. Well, let's look at Oklahoma. Oklahoma, under Lincoln Riley, when they've had a veteran quarterback, have had 2 Heisman Trophy winners and a Heisman Trophy finalist, and put up remarkable numbers on offense. This year, they have a veteran quarterback now in Spencer Rattler, who really responded well to that benching against Texas last year. Rattler's got an outstanding backfield behind him. Kennedy Brooks is a 2-time 1,000-yard rusher that opted out last year. They had in the Tennessee transfer in Eric Gray. The receiving core, I rate number 2 in the country, and the offensive line, I rate number 1 in the country. But you say, well, you know what, they've made the playoff 3 times, and they've given up 54, 45, and 63 points and lost the first playoff game each and every time. But this year, they actually bring a defense to the party. In fact, last year they allowed less yards per game than Alabama did. They gave up just 21 points per game. And this year they have 8 starters back on defense. My number 3 rated defensive line, number 9 set of linebackers, and number 3 defensive backs. I actually think they have a top 5 defense this year to go along with that number 1 offense. And that's why I'm calling for Oklahoma to win their first national title since 2000.
Yeah, I think it's phenomenal. Obviously, they defeated Florida State in that famous 13-2 game, if I'm not mistaken. So looking at this whole scenario and situation, some of the other contenders, of course, in your eyes, I think, are going to be, again, Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, and Georgia. Clemson and Georgia, of course, are facing each other. Tell me what you expect, from this group, who you like the most. What do you think we should be keeping an eye on?
Well, if you look at Ohio State this year, and I mentioned all of the 4 teams that made the playoff last year have lost their starting quarterback, I think C.J. Stroud steps in. The Ohio State's going to be a double-digit favorite in every game, so they are a legitimate national championship contender. Alabama, last year they lost a number 1 draft pick at quarterback, 2 number 1 draft picks at wide receiver, and 3 offensive linemen. They lose the same thing this year. Last year they put up 48 points per game. I don't think they'll be as explosive offensively because their offensive line which I rated number 1 in the country last year, is only number 6 in the country this year. Yeah, that's not much of a drop, but still maybe not as dominant. But their defenses have not had more than 5 returning starters on defense the last 5 years. This year they got 8 starters back, so they'll be favored in every game. Alabama's toughest test is going to be at College Station on October 9th, and then the SEC championship game against Georgia. When you look at Clemson, DJ Uiagalelei is a guy that came in and averaged 38 points per game in his 2 starts last year. They've got my number 1 defensive line in the country. They've got an improved offensive line and receiving positions. Clemson will be favored in every single game this year, including the Georgia one to open up the season. Their toughest 2 tests are probably North Carolina and Miami of Florida, whichever one wins the Coastal, playing them in the ACC title game, are going to have to be a double-digit favorite in every game except for Georgia. And then a couple teams to look at from the SEC, Texas A&M. They did lose 4 starters on the offensive line, but Coach Jimbo Fisher feels they may be even better on the offensive line than last year when they were a Joe Moore Award finalist, and they get that big game against Alabama at home. And then Georgia. Georgia's got J.T. Daniels at QB. They average 38 points per game with him there. They have my number 2 set of running backs in the country, number 3 offensive line in the country. They'll always have a top defense. And they've got a great schedule. They only play 3 SEC road games this year because the Florida game's at a neutral site. Their road games are against 3 first-year head coaches, Auburn, Vanderbilt, and Tennessee. And when you look at who they draw out of the West, they avoid Alabama, Texas A&M, and LSU, which I think are the top 3 teams. Meanwhile, their main competition in East Florida happens to draw Alabama at home and at LSU in Death Valley out of the West. So a much tougher draw on the schedule. Plus Florida, due to the fact that game's at a neutral site, only gets 3 SEC home games in the Swamp this year.
Yeah, going to be a tough one for sure. How will Notre Dame do this year? You have them in your preseason top 10. What can we expect from the Irish? Could they be a dark horse in the college football playoff?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when you look at Notre Dame's schedule, Chris, there's not a single game on the schedule that's easy. I mean, their easiest opponents are Toledo and Purdue, a couple of bowl-caliber teams. But there's also no team on the schedule that's unwinnable. Their toughest games, probably Wisconsin and Chicago, maybe hosting North Carolina, hosting USC. But they are very capable of winning all those. Now, they only have 9 starters back, but they've got 6 on the defensive side of the ball, where they were outstanding last year. So they're going to have one of the top defenses in the country. And while they lose Ian Book at quarterback, they bring in Jack Cohn, who did very well at Wisconsin 2 years ago as the full-time starter. They've got Kyron Williams at running back. They brought in a Kane Madden from Marshall on the offensive line to help a rather young offensive line that still has a lot of talent. So they're a team that could potentially, in fact, one of my main set of power ratings at Notre Dame calls for them to go 12-0. Most of the other ones call for them to have 1 or 2 losses with that schedule they play. But yes, they are definitely a dark horse.
One of the features in your yearly magazine is the surprise team. Why is Washington the team you expect to surprise the most this year?
Yeah, and for your listeners, Chris, the surprise teams, the first thing you have to be is a non-top 10 team, and I think that it has a chance to actually make the playoff. Now, it worked out perfect in 2016. We had Washington, a non-top 10 team, as my number 1 surprise team. They actually made the playoff. 2018, we had Notre Dame. They weren't in the top 10 at the start of the year. They were my number 1 surprise team. They made the playoff that year. And last year we had Texas A&M, a team coming off 5 losses, to be my number 1 surprise team, and they almost made the playoff. They were right there with Ohio State on Selection Sunday. But this year I went with Washington, and the reason for that is Washington is a team that has a huge offensive line. They average almost 330 pounds per man. They've got 2 veteran quarterbacks, a deep set of running backs, top-notch tight ends room, and some good receivers. And the defense is always solid under Jimmy Lake. In the last 2 years, they've had 2 and 6 returning starters on defense. This year they have 8. And then I love their schedule. They avoid USC and Utah out of the Pac-12 South. Their 2 toughest games this year are both at home in Oregon and Arizona State. And I think this year, Chris, home field is going to be even greater than it's ever been because fans were deprived of going to the stadiums last year. They're going to come back with enthusiasm, be super loud. I think home field edge is going to mean a lot this year, and I've actually got Washington favored in all 12 of their games. So if they were to play up to my level of expectations and run the table, they're not going to be in anybody's preseason top 10. In fact, they're going to be picked second in the Pac-12 North by the media, but I think they got a chance of getting in there and getting into the playoff.
Wow. Last year was a very challenging year for Penn State. You have them as your number one most improved team. How much can they improve this year?
They can go from a 4-5 team all the way up to double-digit wins this year. When I look at Penn State coming into last year, I thought James Franklin's done a phenomenal job recruiting for this team. They didn't get the type of year they needed, but they weren't your typical 4-5 team. Generally, a 4-5 team is going to be outgained on the air. Well, Penn State outgained opponents by 102 yards per game last year. Now, that's if you play a 9-game season, you're going to generally be 7-2 or 8-1 with that kind of statistics. But they lost a couple of games, like Indiana, where they had a 488 to 211 yard edge, yet somehow lost. Now, this year they've got 16 returning starters. I think Sean Clifford returns to his 2019 form and is an improved quarterback. Last year they lost their top 3 running backs by the end of the first week of the season. This year they go 4 deep at running back, a veteran offensive line, and one of the top defenses. I don't know if they can win the Big Ten with their schedule. They have to play Wisconsin on the road, Iowa on the road, and Ohio State on the road, but they'll be favored in all the other games. Could pull an upset among those 3, and I think they get to double-digit wins this year.
Could this be Jim Harbaugh's last year at Michigan, in your opinion? How will they do?
I think Michigan's a middle-of-the-pack team this year in the Big Ten East because there's Ohio State, there's Penn State, and then there's Indiana, who Tom Allen's got 17 returning starters coming back. You look at Michigan this year, they do have plenty of guys coming back, but it's from a 2-4 team, and they're breaking in an entirely new defense. Offensively, they're breaking in a new quarterback as well. And then look at their schedule this year, Chris. They play Washington, that team I just talked about, being my number one surprise team. They have to play Wisconsin and Nebraska on the road. They play Penn State on the road, an up-and-coming Maryland on the road, and then they host Ohio State, host Northwestern. There's a lot of toss-up games on their schedule. I think the ceiling for Michigan, if everything went perfect for them this year, probably just 9-3. And when's the last time you said that about Michigan? And meanwhile, the floor for Michigan this year is probably 5-7. So I'm looking at a 6 or 7 win season for them. I do think they get back to a bowl game, but I know Michigan fans wouldn't be too happy with that.
Coaches on the hot seat section, I'm going to just skip ahead of that. Is Jim Harbaugh number 1? How could he not be with that schedule?
Yeah, I think he just signed an extension, but yeah, I would probably put him on that list because I tell you what, if they end up 6-6 this year, that's just not good enough at Michigan.
How will USC do this year?
I like the Trojans. You know, last year they had some second-half comebacks to get to an undefeated record during the regular season, ended up losing the Pac-12 title game, but they really have a lot of talent. And I know Clay Helton is probably number 1 on the hot seat list coming into the year because he is every year. And so, but they've got Keaton Slovis back at QB. They had in a Texas transfer at running back in Keontae Ingram. Dangerous receiving core, and they had in another Texas transfer in Jake Smith. The offensive line looks solid. Defensively, they've got 8 starters back on that side of the ball. So they are very talented. And when you look at their schedule, they do play Arizona State on the road, but they get the big game against Utah at home. They do have to play Notre Dame on the road this year, but they should be favored in probably at least 10 of their games, and they're my favorite to win the Pac-12 South this year.
Okay, just a few general ones now. How will frequent CYInterview guest, Mississippi State head football coach Mike Leach's Bulldogs do this year? Can they get to a bowl game?
I think they do. And, you know, last year they got to a bowl game, but it was with a 3-7 record during the regular season, so it wasn't exactly that. But how about taking over a team in your first year as a head coach, a team that predominantly runs the football 70% of the time, and you run a pass offense that throws the ball 80% of the time, and you don't get the benefit of spring practice. So it was pretty much expected last year that Mississippi State would take that step back. Now they've had spring. They've got 2 capable quarterbacks. I like the Jack Abraham, the transfer from Southern Miss. I think he gives them good depth there. The defense was solid last year already to begin with. I do think Mississippi State gets back to a bowl game this year and back to a much better record.
Very much understandable. So here in Las Vegas, as you know, there's not a lot of expectations for the UNLV running Rebels. 0-6 last year. Can this team get some victories? Can they get to 6 wins? Is that still too far away for this program in a second-year coach?
Yeah, I don't see 6 wins this year. And Marcus Arroyo is one of those first-year head coaches, didn't have the benefit of the spring, so in the fall, he starts to learn his team maybe a little bit, and then they cancel the Mountain West season, then they bring it back. I mean, how much more tougher first-year head coach circumstances can you go through? Now they have some talent. I mean, I like Charles Williams at running back, Kyle Williams at receiver, and there's some talent on the defense, but they're playing in the division with 5 bowl-caliber teams. I think Fresno State, Hawaii, San Jose State, San Diego State, Nevada are all bowl-caliber teams this year. So they should open up the season with a win against Eastern Washington. After that, they'll be an underdog in maybe 10, maybe 11 of their games. The Utah State game, probably their best chance of getting a win at home. Maybe they could steal one at New Mexico. But I think this is going to be really year one for Coach Arroyo, and I think the chances of them getting a bowl game are very slim this year, but raise up considerably next year.
So basically 3 or 4 wins, hopefully.
Their ceiling would probably be 3 or 4 wins, yes.
So what is the best team outside of the big conferences this year?
I got to go with Cincinnati, Chris. And when you look at the Bearcats, last year they ran the table. They finished in the preseason or in the postseason top 10, and that game against Georgia that played in the Peach Bowl, they nearly upset Georgia, led almost start to finish in that game. Now this year they've got Desmond Ridder back at quarterback. He's an NFL caliber QB, probably a first-round draft pick this year. And they have 7 starters back on offense and 7 on defense. And I just love the job Luke Fickell is doing building this team. To go over his first-year edition with them and to go over this year's, they go 3 deep this year at almost every position. A lot of talent, especially on the defensive side of the ball. And what I really like about them is their opportunity. I think this team could actually have a shot at cracking into the playoff, despite the fact they're in the group of 5, because they should enter the season in the top 10. They play a ranked Indiana on the road week 3, which is a toss-up game. If they pull that upset, maybe they move up to 8. And then 2 weeks later, they play Notre Dame in South Bend. Pull that upset over an inexperienced Notre Dame. Cincinnati could be 6, maybe 5. A couple of teams lose in front of them. You might see Cincinnati get all the way to 4. Now, they're going to have a perfect season to have any shot at that. But this is a very talented team. I think Cincinnati is the best group of 5 team out there.
Yeah, that's a great non-conference schedule right there for Cincinnati. Those are the games that the teams have on the schedule to have a chance to get into the college football playoff based on the current circumstances. Very interesting scenario there.
Yeah, and like I said, Coach Luke Fickell's done a great job. He came from Ohio State, and he's trying to get Ohio State type of talent on this team.
How will the possibility of making money off player likeness change college football, and do you think this is a good thing or bad thing?
We'll have to see how it turns out, but I do think it's going to be the rich get richer. I saw a report on ESPN that Bryce Young, who hasn't even started a game for Alabama, has got $1 million deal worked out, or $1 million in endorsements already assigned to him. So you got to think that the teams with the biggest boosters are going to be able to buy the biggest players, and I think it's going to be a rich get richer, but we'll have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I think that's a great scenario. So finally, there has been some discussion about expanding the college football playoff to as many as 12 teams. You write about in the magazine this year, you feel the playoff expansion takes away from the history of the bowl games. I'm in agreement with you on that. Ultimately, what would you like to see happen?
Well, we're going to 12, Chris. They wouldn't let that thing out of the box if they weren't going to. They're not going to try to put that back in the box right now. So I think they pretty much did their test balloons, and it didn't get a lot of negative feedback. I think we're going to go to 12 within the next 2 years.
And then, so I guess your thoughts is that we're looking at teams that are 10, 11, 12, 3 losses, possibly 4 losses. You start asking yourself, will these people really get a chance, or should they really have a chance to play for the college football national championship, right?
Yeah, and you also have to wonder a little bit about the importance of the games in the regular season and even in the postseason. You take a look at the SEC championship game this year. Let's say Alabama and Georgia both have 1 loss or 0 losses, and let's say they both have 1 loss, and they're playing in the SEC title game with the 14 playoff. Winners in the playoff and losers out. It's an all or nothing game. 12-team playoff, winners in, but guess what? Losers in too. So it's really not an all or nothing game anymore.
Yeah, I don't like that. It takes away from the conference championship weekend and the drama of that, and the reality of that. I agree with you 100%. I think it'd be nice to expand the playoff a little bit so teams like Cincinnati do have a chance, or Central Florida in the past have a chance to compete for a national championship. But expanding it to 12 is beyond what we should be doing.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and but like I said, we're pretty much headed there, so I'm not going to try to fight it.
Okay, I understand that. So in closing, make sure you go to philsteele.com. You can get the physical copy mailed to you, or you can access the digital version online to look at every team's predictions for the upcoming college football season. Phil, thanks so much as always for being on CYInterview. Anything you want to add in closing?
Only that appreciate you having me on each and every year, Chris. I know you have a lot of big-time celebrities on there, and so very pleased to be part of your role.
Well, you're the celebrity of college football analysis. You should know that by now.
Well, it's been 27 years that the magazine's pretty much been the book the experts can't do without, so we keep grinding away.
Oh, I look at it every year. It's the first thing I look at when we start the college football season. Phil, as always, thanks so much for joining us on CYInterview, and do hang on with me.